During the session, we may speak about forward-facing features that are in pilot or beta. Please make all your implementation, purchasing, and investment decisions based on what we have available now. Now let's get started with today's CodeLive session, Code Reviews for Fun and Commit.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today we're going to be doing a little bit different of a CodeLive. Normally we sit down and we code a project. Today we're going to be talking about and doing code reviews. Specifically, we're going to talk about what a code review is, why we do code reviews, some questions to ask during code reviews, and I want to emphasize that that's a non-exhaustive list. And then we're actually going to code review some actual code. And then we'll have our recap there at the end, as usual. So with me today, I have Ryan Headley. Ryan is a lead member of the technical staff on EDA, or the Education Data Architecture, over at Salesforce.org. He's also the front man for the band Apex and the Limits, which is everyone's favorite Dreamforce band. Do you want to say anything more about Apex and the Limits, Ryan?
No, I think you covered it, man. I think that's
all right. And as usual, I'm Kevin Poorman. You can hit me on Twitter at CodeFryer. I'm a developer evangelist, and my fun fact this week is I like sloths. So let's talk a little bit about what a code review is. Everyone, I think, by the time they have spent a little time in the workforce, knows they should be doing code reviews, participating in some fashion with code reviews. But at least when I started off, I didn't have any idea what they were. I was told day 2 of my first development job that I would be doing code reviews and that my code would be reviewed, but I didn't really have any idea what that meant. So just as a baseline about what code reviews are and why we should do them, let's just talk a little bit about it. I like to think of code reviews as a process of asking questions. Now, I'm very particular about saying process because very rarely does a code review happen once. The conversations that the code reviews are most like a conversation. So I'm going to ask Ryan a couple of questions or ask him to do a couple things about code. He's going to either come back and say, well, have you thought about this? Or what about that? And they are questions and conversations with those questions about the code. They're not just, no, you fail, or this is the worst code I've ever seen. Though that's not a code review. That's a demoralizing event that we should probably bring HR into. And because of that, code reviews are not intended to shame. And I remember I had a code review once at my very first job, and I learned a lot from it, but almost none of it was intended to teach me. What I learned from one of my first code reviews was that I didn't have any idea what I was doing, and that the senior dev who was doing my code review was very clear about my inadequacies. I felt very shamed, and that's not what a code review is for. We don't want to do that. And most importantly, I think when you do a code review, you're reviewing other people's code. So, and we'll get into why here in a minute, but Ryan, is there anything you want to add about what a code review is?
I think you hit it pretty well. It's really just a chance for us to ensure that we've got good code smell in places. And to your point, we never try to point fingers or anything. It's not an opportunity for somebody to strut their stuff and show how smart they are or how much smarter. It's an opportunity for you to mentor and teach as well as learn yourself. And I've, in doing code reviews, I've managed to learn things as well. So yeah, it's collaborative, and to your point, absolutely a process. So
yeah. So when we talk about what a code review is, this is why we do code reviews. We do code reviews because we get more eyes on code, and the more eyes we get on code means that we have more chances to catch things, to learn things, and to mentor others. And I think all three of those are really important. If we were to, a lot of times the idea of a code review is, I'm going to go find all the bugs. I got to read through somebody else's code, find all the ways they screwed it up, and tell them how to fix it. And I feel like that's kind of a toxic way of looking at code reviews, because if we looked at other things in our life that way, we would immediately throw a red flag. So if we looked at relationships with our spouse or significant others as an opportunity to find all of the mistakes that they were making and all their inadequacies as a human being, everyone would go, no, wait, that's not appropriate. That's not what a relationship is about. And code reviews I think are similar. If we look at it only as a way of catching things or telling others what they need to fix, then we are really missing out on both the ability to learn from other people's code and the ability to mentor people in either best practices or hard-fought lessons from our careers. So when I talk about why we do a code review, these three things they're co-equal, right? We've got to catch issues, we've got to learn from the code, and we've got to mentor other people in what we know as best practices. So with that said, the question then is, how do you do a code review? And we're going to actually jump in and do a code review. We're going to use some technology to do that, and that technology we're going to use is the GitHub code review system. That's not meant to be prescriptive. You can do code reviews in a number of ways. We're just doing it this way so that we can preserve the code review for other people to look at later on. But when you do a code review, you've got to ask questions. And remember, we're doing this as part of a conversation, dialogue. And so when we ask these questions, these aren't questions that are meant to degrade again. So we can ask questions like, does this code compile without PMD warnings? And you may not know what PMD warnings is. We'll get to that in just a second. But we can also ask things like, does it have meaningful test coverage? And that is more than just, do we have 75% test coverage? That's also, do we have assertions in our tests? Do our tests generate their own data? Are the tests well formed for our code as well? We can ask questions about PII, or personally identifiable information. Oftentimes the systems and work that we do in Salesforce is tied to information that is either protected information or information that we probably don't want falling into everyone's hands. So we do things like CRUD and FLS checks, but do we have that verified in our tests? So we can look at that as well. We can look at things like, do our triggers contain logic? That's not to say that triggers can't contain logic, especially as you start to adopt code review practices. There's going to be a spectrum where you have to slowly start to adopt these things. But do we want to note that we've got trigger logic in a trigger? And the biggest question that I like to ask is, does this code refactor? And the reason I ask this question is, if a code refactors, should we do that refactoring? I like to have my code be as simple as possible, and one of my flags for refactoring is, oh, there's something I can do to simplify it. Does that sort of make sense, Ryan? Do you have anything you want to add to this?
With the refactoring, we do it, little by little as well. I try not to boil the ocean. Let's start out refactoring maybe just a part of a class somewhere that tends to get a little complicated. Look for opportunities to perhaps genericize where you can so that it can be reused in other places in the code. Try not to tightly couple things together is usually a help. So those are the kinds of things I kind of look for there as well. Some of the other ones that you just want to look for, and this might be getting a little in the weeds, but if you're, say, we had an issue not long ago where we have to be compatible with Shield, so you have to be sure that you can't put potentially encryptable fields and where clauses in SOCL, and being able to watch out for things like that and then suggest and teach when you do find stuff like that. So
that's a good call. I like your don't boil the ocean. How do you draw the line between saying, we can refactor this and we should refactor this? Do you create like stories to go back and refactor where possible and put them on the backlog, or do you just note them, or how do you handle that on your team?
Generally, we will note them in something like a code review and then generate a work item off of that. If it's something that we decide we need to talk a little further on, might be an investigation first to see how far down that refactoring road we can go. We also try to find out, if we refactor it, are we refactoring just for the sake of refactoring, or are we really making it simple, right? Are we refactoring just because somebody's got the idea that they didn't like the way something was done, versus is it still getting it done, still usable, but do you really have to go all the way to let's make it generic when perhaps it is something that in some cases should with all intents and purposes be tightly coupled. That's not usually the case. I don't like to say stuff like that, but there are considerations when you go down that road. So yeah, we will look at it. We'll note it in the code review. If there's significant discussion around it, we generally spin up an investigation behind that and figure out how far down the path we can go.
And the last thing I want to add to that, because you sort of raised it to my attention here, is oftentimes we think about code reviews as being done between, say, two people, the person who wrote the code and the person who's been assigned to review it. But sooner or later, you're going to run into an issue where you really should bring in more people on that code review. And there's a number of reasons why that may occur. Like, you may end up in a situation where you're at sort of an impasse with the person who wrote the code. You think something needs to change and it's a critical issue, and you've provided them mentoring feedback as to why and how it should change, and they've just decided that no, they're not going to do that. That's a great opportunity to bring another team member into the code review. Another time to do that would be, hey, we have this best practice of not tightly coupling things, but this is a place where it really makes sense. And getting somebody else's opinion on that in the code is really important in those situations as well. So with that said, if you want to look at the project that we're going through and the code review that we're actually going to leave, it's leave up for people to look at. It's on this GitHub repository, and you can visit that in your browser, and you'll actually get to see the code review bits that we're doing, because we're going to go through them. We're going to provide issues and feedback, and then we're not going to resolve any of it. So you can always snapshot in time, go back and look at this repository and see what kind of feedback we gave. And so I'm going to cancel out of the slides here, and I'm going to go to our browser window. This is our GitHub window. I didn't make a good font size check. Ryan, can you read that okay?
It's pretty small, but I've also got my windows split right now, so I have my version of it and your version. But yeah, I think that's probably good there.
Okay, so this is our repository, and we've gone into pull requests. Now, GitHub has a whole system around doing things with pull requests. Pull requests is what GitHub calls it. If you talk to other large enterprise organizations, they may call them change lists or change sets, or some variation on that. But we've got these two pull requests here, one that I put in that has some clearly bad code, and then another one that Ryan has put in. So we're going to jump into this some bad code one. And I'm going to go into look at the commit here, and I'm going to do review changes. Now, when I do review changes, it gives me a blanket, this is a basic note. And it's just a comment. I can submit that. And you'll see that it's put that note there. Now, that's not terribly useful, so let's go back and try that again and look at what we can actually do here in our code. Now, I've got two files, one of which is a test class. We'll look at that here in just a second. And then I've got this class here called simply bad code. You can see everything in the class here is green, which means it's net new. And then I have this plus sign that shows up on the left, and I can go over here and I can choose a particular line, and I can call out something here. So I can say, what is the benefit of having this be static method? And Brian, that's a question, which we said we wanted to ask questions, but that doesn't necessarily broker conversation, or is that kind of, I mean, I could see how some people might read that as somewhat accusatory or, hey dummy type thing.
Right.
What could we do to make that better?
I usually come through with things like, rather than just saying, hey, what's the benefit here? It's more along the lines of, help me understand the decision to make it static. How do you see people using this in a static versus if we needed an instance method? Just to make it more conversational. That first question you had there in my mind really wasn't horrible, but yeah, depending on who's reading that, you could look at that and be like, "Ooh, they're really, they're turning the screws here, or whatever." So yeah, I usually try to come at it from I need to be educated, right? You need to help me understand why this is this way.
Yeah. So I'm just typing up some questions that maybe I would put in here. Would an instance method make sense coupled with a static wrapper? So we can use it both ways. I think this is a good that's a good question to ask. It's also a good opportunity for us to say something that is contextual to our organization. So we tend to strive away from static methods, if only because A, B, or C, right? And I don't really have a good reason to say we strive away from static methods for this code base, because this code base is purely an example. But what I like to try to do is start off with questions and then provide some guidance from my experience in that org. And when you do, so you work on a team, you probably have what, 10 people on your team?
No, I think we are, if you're just talking developers, I think we have 5 if you include me right now.
5 developers.
Yeah.
And you're probably all doing code reviews, right?
Yeah, we do trade off and on, and we do usually have multiple eyes on a code review. One person is generally assigned, one developer is usually assigned, but other developers are free to come in and comment and even submit their own reviews, even if they're not assigned as the reviewer. We like to have multiple thoughts and multiple eyes on the code. I'm not going to catch everything all the time. It's very rare that I would catch everything all the time, and by having those multiple eyes, you'll catch pieces of it. Somebody else is going to catch another piece or have another suggestion, and you may even learn from that. So,
yep.
Yeah, we try to have many eyes on that.
All right. So tactically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Add Sequel Comment here. Now, that doesn't mean I can't go back and add another comment, but I could, because I can fire that open again. But I can also go through here and I can look at other pieces of this code as well. Ryan, does anything grab your attention in the rest of this class that we might want to address in a code review?
Absolutely. I'm seeing some DML inside of a for loop there.
Yeah.
Probably not something we want to do.
Right. And so at least early in my career, I would have written something like, you don't do DML in a for loop. End of discussion. But again, that's not necessarily helpful feedback. What do you think we could do to make this more helpful for, especially those new developers who this may be the first time they've written Apex code and they don't know why we can't do DML in a for loop?
Right. So we would definitely call it out. That certainly seems terse as a comment there as well. But I would say more along the lines of when we perform DML in a for loop, the platform can hit issues with limits, right? It's just generally the best practice is to put that stuff into a list and then persist the list outside of the loop. So you have to give them some educational input as well, especially if you're talking with a junior programmer or somebody who is the first time on their platform. It's maybe their first pull request. You don't want to come out of the gates guns firing. You want to come from a place of educating and learning. And so sometimes even what we'll do is we'll provide a link to something with even more information, or perhaps somebody can explain it better than I can, right? So that's generally what we would do. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was good.
So one of the things I want to call out here is a very subtle thing. I initially started off with, you don't do DML in a for loop, right? Ryan, when you came back and gave me your understanding of what to say, you said when we do DML in a for loop, the platform may trigger governor limits. And there's an important distinction that I think is really critical in being empathetic in our code reviews, and that is we don't use the word you. Right? Because as soon as we say you, that it feels like we're blaming, for good or for ill, the person who wrote the code, and that's not the purpose of the code review. We're not looking for defects in the person, we're looking for issues and things that we can learn and mentor about in the code. And so instead of saying we don't do DML in a for loop, you say when we do DML in a for loop, and then you give me the consequences. And right after that, we can put in the link to governor limits, so that they can see what those governor limits are. And I think this is much more helpful, much more helpful. I would also like to say that when we fill this sort of comment out, this is the kind of comment that I would draw a hard line on. I would say we expect code in our code base to be free of to follow, let's see, how do I want to phrase it? To persist lists of information outside of the for loop. So I've set up a clear expectation, and this is one of the ones where I would say this is something that has to be addressed, right?
Yes.
So a mentoring comment that teaches, what's going on, and then also a clear expectation of what has to change for this code to pass code review.
Yep.
Is there anything else we should add to this, do you think?
Generally, I think you might provide an example. In this case, maybe the example is not necessary. It's more of a simple situation. But if something were a little more complex, you could provide even some pseudocode or an encoding example outright right there in it as well.
Yeah, so we can, not 1 equals 0, I equals 0. I can type. And then, do list contact. And then do insert contacts. And when we preview this, I use some GitHub flavored markdown. When we preview this, it's going to show it as code. So I'm going to add that single comment, right? And this is what I hope for when I'm receiving a code review. I want to receive a helpful mentoring message that is not calling me out for something I may have done out of ignorance, right? Because if I'm a first-time developer, I may not know that this is a bad pattern. But something that teaches me in a positive way, and then gives me an example, because I think we all learn from reading other people's code. So an example code is really helpful here. I think that's probably it for this class. Shall we look at a test class?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hide this one. And we've got this class here. This is the PA test class. It's from a previous CodeLive episode that we did. We've got some tests in here. You'll notice that this is an is-test, and we've got a test setup method. Now, one of the things I also like to do is look for things that I particularly enjoy about the code, or that I think are well done about the code, and call them out. And so I'm going to stop here and say, I love the way we encourage the use of test setup methods. Good job. And I know this is a little bit, I don't want to call anybody out for having made a mistake, but I will call someone out for having done something good, right? This is a great way to encourage our developers, especially those who are junior to us, to follow best practices. And I just like to put that in there just to start with. A friend of mine, one of the other evangelists, like to talk about the praise sandwich. So he likes to say, start off with what you did well, and then talk about the things you could improve, and then reiterate the things that you did well. And I think we could do worse than the praise sandwich, as it were, with code reviews. As we look through this test, does anything come to mind for you? I know I'm just sort of putting you on the spot.
Oh, no, that's fine. And I'll get to that really quickly. I just want to kind of add to that with the whole praise sandwich. A lot of times, and I will call out things that I really enjoyed and appreciate that they did. I'm a big stickler for style, and when they're going into an existing class that may not be, maybe it's legacy code, or maybe it was, put it in at the last minute and not a whole lot of attention was paid, and so we got even something as small as spacing issues or capitalization issues. If I see that they've gone and updated it and changed it, I always thank them. I'm like, thank you for this. This is awesome. This is a way to keep our technical debt lower, et cetera. So I always make sure that I do that. With this method in particular, the test setup, I have to be honest, I am reading this not quite for the first time, but pretty close for the first time. But what I'm seeing in here is a lot of the variable names and variable calls and object instantiations and stuff, not really sticking with the same sort of style. A lot of stuff's all lowercase, which is fine if that's your style that we use. I know generally we don't use that kind of style here. So yeah, you've got lines 34 and 35 there, right? You have new account there as lowercase, but then on the next line, you've got it starting with an uppercase. And I think maybe that sees either a typo or really whatever. I would like, those kinds of things to be addressed. Depending on the urgency of the PR, there are some times where I'll say, hey, I won't deny this from going through, but let's come back and fix that in the next release so that it's cleaned up, depending like if it's a hot fix or something like that. I won't hold it up, but I will make a comment on such things. So I'm seeing a lot of that through here is for me and my old eyes, all lowercase things are really hard for me to read. I do prefer the camel case. You've got like on line 143 system dot assert not equals, and I think I've actually jumped out of the method that you're currently in. But I'm seeing that throughout this class, and that is something that I would certainly make a comment on. Something along the lines of, let's try to be consistent with our variable naming and style within the class, right?
Yeah, I think this brings up a couple things that I was researching best practices for code reviews, and so I read Google's best practice document, and I read one from Perforce, and I read a couple of others. And one of the things that consistently came up is this idea that you should only do code reviews for a certain amount of time at a time. So that some people said no more than an hour at a time. Other people said no more than 20 minutes at a time. And the reason they were driving that home is because you get caught up in sort of the copy editing things about code, the stylistic things, do we have an errantly capitalized C in account here? And these are all things that I think we can sort of automate. And so rather than saying we shouldn't do code reviews for more than an hour at a time, although that's probably a good idea, I want to say we should automate the boring, the very detail-oriented bits, because even the best of us are going to miss some of those details as we read through the code. And so what I've done is I've set up this code base and our PRs using Codacy, which we've talked about before. And Codacy has the ability to look at these pull requests, and I'm going to look at mine. So here's my thing, and it's going to tell me that I've got 14 issues that it's come up with, and those issues range from stylistic things like this test method name doesn't match the regex we've set for what our method name should be. So this is saying test cmdd submit. That's not a valid, doesn't match our code style, right? It's also got things that are warnings, these yellow lines, where this is a perfectly valid system assert method, right? But our code style says that we should also be using the third parameter to asserts to give us that friendly message back. And one of the things that I like about Codacy is that we can expand this, and it will show us exactly the line that's going on, and we can go in and say, okay, line 108, and we could look at this and say, let's scroll down to line 108. All right, and here we go. Here's our system assert. We can modify that, or we can call that out, saying, this is serious enough that we want it to be addressed. But we've automatically scanned our code for things like that. And one of the things that's really nice about this is it can enforce not only stylistic things, but also things like PMD warnings. Now, I mentioned PMD at the very beginning of this. PMD is a static code analysis tool, and it really automates a lot of the ability to catch not necessarily stylistic things, but logical issues or stylistic issues in your code base. So some of the styles, like method names, are going to pop up, but sometimes it's also things like avoid an empty block statement. And we might not catch that in a densely blocked section of code. But here we've got, line 148, there's nothing in my if statement. It's all tied to else. So we should probably refactor that, right? And I really enjoy this tool for that job. There are others out there. I'm not calling it out there. But one of the things that I do like is that it gives you the color coding. And you'll see that this one has 2 red bars. These are things that it definitely thinks we should fix. And the first one is that my class doesn't define a sharing model. So I don't have class with sharing or class without sharing. I should definitely put that in there. And then the last one is CRUD permissions before SOCL and DML options. So this is interesting enough, this more serious one to PMD, that I'm not looking to see whether or not we can insert a contact. The insert in a DML loop only shows up as a warning. I find that interesting.
Me too. So if I may ask really quickly, with Codacy, does it let you change those back to a red if you really wanted that to be red and have it report back based on your organization's preferences?
Yep, you can go through and change the pattern list and set them up if you'd like. You can even put a PMD configuration file custom to your org or to your company in the root of the repository, and it will follow that one. So you can change the weightings, and you can, like that. We have the regex for the method names. If that's a perfectly valid method name for your company, then you go in and you would change that regex so that this is okay, and that those would all go away.
Very nice.
So one of the things I want to encourage you to do is include a tool like Codacy or a CI tool that is going to run your test coverage, that is going to look at your static code analysis, that is going to enforce your style before you even get to the point where somebody's doing this style code review, right? And there are a lot of ways to do that. We talked about setting CI up in one of our very first episodes. I encourage you to watch that one again. It'll show you how we used Husky to do the pre-commit hooks for stylistic changes, stylistic enforcement. And by the time you get to doing a code review, and this is one of the questions we got from the community, Ryan, is sort of when do you do the code review? And my answer to that is you do the code review after automated testing has run and succeeded, and after all the stylistic and static code analysis tools have run and the issues they bring up have been addressed. So by the time it gets to a human code reviewer, we're still having a conversation. This isn't just an opportunity for me to go, hey, it looks good for me and rubber stamp it. It's still a place for me to look at the architecture and ask questions and mentor people and learn from them as well. I know I harp on mentoring, but I also want to say I learn new technologies and new patterns from doing code reviews. I remember when I was first working on asynchronous stuff, I sat down and I read through some code that used queuables, and I got queuables all of a sudden by reading their code. So it's not just about just the mentoring, it's also how at least I learn new technologies.
Absolutely agree with that statement.
Yeah. So our test class here, we've got a whole bunch of issues from Codacy, but there's one that I wanted to draw our attention to, and that is down here, this final test method. And I know this test method is quite long, doesn't quite fit on a page, but nowhere in this test method, this test CMDT coverage, do we have any assertions.
There's a couple of assertions in there, but they don't know how useful they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're not within the start test. They're not after stop test.
I got you. I see what you're saying. Yes.
So we've got this. It's going to set up some sanity checks, for lack of a better term, making sure the data makes sense for this test. But this test doesn't actually make an assertion saying that our code did anything. And so this is one of my pet peeves, as it were. One of the things that I would definitely hold up a PR for. And so I'm going to add in here, perhaps this is the result of a bad branch merge, but this seems to be missing functional, meaningful asserts after stop test. Now, I tend to go in and put a bunch of comments in and then come back and refactor them to make sure that I am, following my own guidelines on being kind and empathetic in code reviews. Is there a way you would like to phrase this or put information in here? What kinds of things would you add, Ryan?
I would just want to make sure that, when we're writing tests, we want to ensure that we're testing those conditions that you're expecting to generate in those tests, because at the end of the day, this is what's going to save your hind end when bugs and things are introduced, because you can go and run the unit tests and try to figure out if you can reproduce the issue or not. And if not, then you write another unit test with those assertions as well. I think I actually like how you opened that one too, is perhaps this is a result of a bad branch merge. You're giving them the benefit of the doubt there as well. Yep. Yeah, I'm actually on board with that sort of comment, I think.
Yeah, so I think this is sort of a synthesis of what you were saying and what I was trying to get at. When we write tests, we want to make sure that we're asserting the resulting values to ensure the code is working as we expect. And then I would say before we, I don't want to use I or you, before we can merge this, we need to address the lack of assertions. Now, I say a lack of assertions. I'm also picky in that you have to have assertions that make sense, right? Mm-hmm. So I've seen a number of unit tests in my day that were, at the end of it, they're like, assert true. And I'm like, well, that will never fail. That doesn't do any good. So I want unit tests to be meaningful as well. And part of what I look for in a meaningful assertion is that the condition is clearly stated, that the expectation is clearly stated, and that I am using that friendly message. So just as a friendly reminder, all of the assertion all the assertion methods on the Salesforce platform, except a final parameter that is optional, that is a string. So I expected this to happen, and it didn't. Something along those lines. That gets dropped in the logs when the test fails, so that you can see the test class and test method that we're failing, as well as what you expected and what actually occurred. Which means, when you get a test failure, you can immediately be off to debugging it rather than having to go through and try and figure out what's going on.
Right.
So,
and I would also say that your test method names should actually discuss what it is actually being tested. Since in general, you want your unit test to be testing small pieces here and there. So the test method itself, test CMDT coverage, doesn't really tell me what that is actually testing. That way, when you see failing test, you can see that method name, you know exactly what condition was being tested and that it failed, rather than having to then dive into this and try to figure out what it was testing in the first place.
We can quickly identify what went, what we expected, and what failed. So yeah, there's another great point there. Now, Ryan, we've done a lot here on this code that I brought in, and intentionally brought in this code so that we would have plenty of things to look at. You've also got some code in here that is a pull request in there. Let's go ahead and switch over to your pull request. So to do that in GitHub's user interface, I'm going to go to pull requests, and then this is the one that that Ryan added, and he's added me as the assignee, so I'm the assigned reviewer here. So I'm going to go in here, and as the assigned reviewer, this tool gives me a couple extra options. So I'm going to jump into the commits and look at this first file here, which is our account management class. And like before, I had the ability to click over here on the left and add a comment. I'm going to use this as an example. comment, and I can do that add single comment, or I can click this start a review. And so you can see that now I'm doing a review. These comments are things that will be mentioned for Ryan to address. So we'll add that comment there. Okay. Is there anything in this particular class that you wanted to call out, Ryan, here?
So one thing that we try to do in any of our coding efforts is to try to keep methods down to a very small, typical do one thing and do it well fashion. And so if we look at line 79, from line 79 to 299 is all of this run method. So that is, it's evidence that it is doing way, way too much. And go ahead.
299.
299, yeah, it's
Right,
still
so
going.
I've been scrolling for days.
Yes.
Here we go. Right, all
There you
that
go.
code is one long method. I tend to try and keep my methods down to 50 lines or less as a not as a hard and fast rule, but as a guideline, because if I get beyond that, then I might have opportunities to refactor things out. Does your team have a rule based on line count, or is it just like you go by whether or not you think it's too long?
Right now, we don't necessarily have a line count. It's more of a gut feel in looking at things. We don't have any hard and fast rule like, oh, it must be 50 lines or it must be 25 lines, etc. I try to say, like, if I have to scroll like more than 2 little squigglies, and we might have to be something to think about. It really depends on, you know, are they including a bunch of comments and things like that, or are there, you know, bunch of variable initializations and stuff because they need them. It's just, it's evidence when I have to start scrolling a lot that we need to look at this and see if there's any way to simplify. You know, in some cases, there's a lot of validation that might take place in a method. I'm not sure if this one actually applies, but it might make sense then, you know, to introduce a validator class that then you can pass some information to and then just call really simple methods on that rather than doing all of that validation in line in that same method, right? So those are the kinds of things I would talk about. So for a comment on this, I would say, you know, we try to ensure that our methods do one thing and do it well for testability. Because at the end of the day, something like this, it's very hard to test the various pieces to figure out what's broken. So if we can break that out, each section into its own method, we can test those methods individually and get a lot more granular with those tests. And we can find out for sure which part is actually breaking in this big 130 line method, or however, 230 line method, whatever it is.
And I think this brings us to an important distinction. Until now, we've looked at code that had technical faults, right? This don't do DML in a for loop, right? That's clearly a technical fault, whereas this one is more of an architectural thing. And this is where we can really step up and provide that mentoring feedback to other developers. Even if that other developer is someone who's got 10 years more experience than us, we can say, you know, this is an opportunity for us to refactor, but it also means we have to read through the code, understand what it's doing, and then provide suggestions for refactoring. So in this particular case, you mentioned, you know, this method does a lot of validation. And we may have an opportunity to refactor the validation into its own class and make testing easier and faster. Faster, maybe. And then and testing easier and faster. This is also an opportunity where we can say, you know, let's look at pair programming together to excise or refactor out the validation class. There's a subtle thing here, and not only have we switched from a technical fault, like this is something that will be a bug or at scale will be an issue, to something that, you know, technically is fine. This code works, right? It's got tests that pass, etc. But it's not necessarily the most maintainable code. And this is where code reviews really shine, because we can enforce not only technical correctness, but we can work on helping the maintainability of our code base.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've got, I'm going to go ahead and hit comment on that. The other thing that I like about doing this is, if you get into a situation where you are offering an architectural or refactoring opportunity as part of a code review, I always like to volunteer to work with them on that, because there's only so much that I can put in here in a comment. Whereas if I'm saying, you know, hey, let's work on this together, then I have the opportunity to really dive into and say, you know, so last time I had this situation, this is kind of how we tackled it, and work with the developer and help them understand how to identify when they should be pulling that code out, so that we don't see this in another pull request later.
Yep.
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 So we got a couple more questions from the community here I want to dive into. Is the code scan tool flexible for code review or PMD? I'm not entirely sure what you mean there, but that goes along with the next question, which is, please suggest tools for code review and code analysis. When we're doing code reviews, there's so many ways you can do it. You know, when I first started doing code reviews, it was literally pull up a chair next to the developer who wrote the code, and then the two of us would sort of spend time looking over one another's shoulders as we made questions and comments and had that dialogue. Nowadays, there's tools like GitHub or GitLab, whatever your source control system is, Bitbucket, all the very major ones have a Git, or sort of a code review system built in through merge requests or pull requests, however they phrase it. It's still the same idea, where you're leaving code comments like this. And this is great, especially for distributed teams, because I can do a code review at, you know, 9 a.m. my time, even though the developer who wrote it is, you know, fast asleep in his time zone or her time zone. So I like doing the code reviews here, but they're not necessarily the only tools you can use. You can still just sit down next to the person and go over the code. You know, Ryan, are there code review tools that your team uses?
Right now, no, but after seeing Codacy, it is one thing that I would strongly consider. We do have PMD, now that I think about it, running locally for some of us. I don't know that we all have it right now, and we're still trying to hone our rules to fit with what we want them to do. But right now, we do just leverage the GitHub PR system, and right now, just our naked eyes looking at it, right? To your point, you know, my very first code reviews when I did this were actually done in a room on a projector with the entire development team, right?
Oh,
so
wow.
That's another way. Yeah, it could be very, very stressful for a junior programmer, right? And so, yeah, there's multiple ways to do it. I liked our entire team is distributed. We have people in Seattle and San Diego and Boston and Virginia and here in Madison. And so having this online collaboration makes it so much easier.
Yeah, I really like the ability to put these, to do code reviews asynchronously that are still conversation based. I really enjoy that with the various source management tools that come with GitHub and Bitbucket and GitLab, etc. Somebody's asking about suggesting tools for code reviews. So I'm going to divide code reviews into two things. One is the stuff we've talked about mostly today, which is sort of human-led code reviews. The tools for that I like to use are built into whatever your source control system is. The other half of sort of code reviews, that other bucket, is sort of things that you can automate, that automated code review. And when we get into the Salesforce platform, we've got, we don't have the world's largest set of options. There's Apex PMD. That's, I'll put it here in a comment. It's Apex PMD. And I don't remember what PMD stands for, but this is a tool that does static code analysis. And when Codacy runs its scan of the code, it's running Apex PMD against the Apex classes. That's the tool that it's using. Codice is just sort of a user interface and convenience tool on top of Apex PMD. As you get into Lightning Web Components, as you get into Aura, you gain JavaScript linting. So there's ESLint, and that linting is going to provide you, a linter is a tool that's going to provide you, this is syntactically incorrect, or this is prone to errors this way. That's what a linter is going to give you. And then it also has the ability to run what I like to call stylistic formatters. So in the Lightning Web Components and JavaScript area, we have Prettier. There's also Prettier Apex, which is a plugin for Prettier that will consistently format Apex code. And these are things, these automated tools are things that I would want run and resolve any issues resolved before it got to a human code review. So you said you've got PMD running locally, Ryan,
yeah.
But Codice that we saw here, this is going to give us sort of PMD in the cloud. It's going to run the scan and show us the results of it. That's what this is. If we had Lightning Web Components or JavaScript or XML, other code patterns that Codice supports are things like, well, there's remarklint, which is for markdown. You can go in and if you've got a JavaScript, you can put in ESLint for JavaScript, Prettier, and various other ones show up here in the code patterns. That's and this is just one of many tools. Codice just happens to be the one that I like. There are many of them out there. Yeah, so we got another question here. It says, this person is a freelance contractor. They work as the only developer on their team. How can I leverage code review practices as there's no one to review my code? Yikes, that's a tough one. So first off, you can always use automated tools to review your code. So it's amazing what you learn when you first start using something like Apex PMD, because it's going to bring to your attention things that you've been doing for years that have never been a problem for you, that it's going to say this is problematic. And at first you'll be like, oh, this is so frustrating. It's finding all these useless things. But as you get into it, you'll realize, no, it really is going to be an issue at scale, because right now I've got 10 users using this, but as soon as I get this out and deployed to the entire field service team of 10,000 people, suddenly I'm going to start hitting governor limits with the way I wrote this. And PMD is going to be really good at sort of highlighting those issues for you. It's also really good at highlighting security issues. So if you're a ISV managed package developer, you definitely want to look into using PMD. It's going to warn you about not checking for FLS and CRUD before you do things like that. And then as far as human code reviews, I think there's value in having admins participate in code reviews. I know this is kind of a touchy topic, but if you can't sit down with somebody and explain what your code does without talking down to someone who doesn't write code, then it's probably too complex, right? So you should be able to say, this is validating that I've got proper input and I'm looking for these 3 things. And your admin should be able to give you code review feedback on that. Like, they're not going to give you stylistic or structural feedback. They're not going to say, well, nested ifs are kind of ugly, but they're going to be like, yeah, no, that logically makes sense. So you can always include people who are non-developers in on that. And I think you can also, if you are a freelance developer, you should be able to go to your company, for lack of a better term, and say, look, part of what makes me a better developer is having my code reviewed and reviewing other people's code. I would like to, provide access to the code to have somebody review it periodically and see what they say to that. I have no idea whether or not that'll work in your situation, but that's definitely something I would ask. Do you have any other feedback on that, Ryan?
I want to echo the usage of tools. When I was a Python developer, I was just writing your standard Python code, but it wasn't until I installed PyLint, a lint checker for Python, that my coding went to the next level. So if you leverage those linters and stuff like that, you will see what we call bad code smell ahead of time. And then you're able to address those, and then those become kind of cemented in your mind after you see them again and again and again. You learn from it. So definitely those. And I agree for the human side. Yeah, it helps oftentimes. to have to explain what your code is doing to somebody who is not a coder, because they will ask the questions that a developer might take for granted or might just not think of. And this happens all the time with us in QA. Is, me being a developer, I admittedly have a tendency to overcomplicate some things, and sometimes the simpler questions coming from someone that doesn't have the experience in the code side of things might kind of ring a bell, and you're like, oh, I didn't even think of that solution. Absolutely right. And that's happened to me on numerous occasions. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a coder. I echo Kevin's point. If you're having a hard time explaining what it's doing, it's probably a little too complex, and it's a bit of a bad code smell already for you. So
I think it's also important to remember that on the Salesforce platform, where you can do so much declaratively without writing any code, having people who don't write code for a living review your code is a great opportunity, not only for your code to be better, but for the overall org to be better. So for instance, if you're defensively programming and writing some validation of input, and the person who's reviewing your code is more of an admin-focused person, and they're like, well, if we put a validation rule on this, there's going to be no situation in which a record could be created that would fail that validation. And that sort of switch where you're like, okay, no, I'm going to move this to a validation rule is something that's unique to our platform, but also that validation rule then benefits the entire org overall, not just your functions in the code. So I want to encourage people to have non-coders who are admins on the platform do code reviews as well. So we've got just a couple minutes left. Let me switch back over to our slides here. And today we intentionally looked through GitHub's built-in code review system to put some comments in on codes. We did identify some issues, but we tried to, when we identified those issues, we tried to leave structured mentoring comments. So, this is what we do as a team, not this is what you did wrong, but this is how we handle this situation. Clear expectations of what has to change before the commit can be merged. And we tried to be informative as well. So not only like we don't do DML and for loops, but here's the governor limit documentation page. You probably want to go commit this to memory, that sort of thing. Some key takeaways: you should always do your code reviews, and you should focus on not just catching things, but learning and mentoring in that code review. There are plenty of tools out there for code reviews, both automated and human. The minimum, I want to tell you to just walk through the code while sitting next to the developer. I think if you did them on an overhead projector with the entire development team, that might be a little intimidating. Even for experienced developers, let alone new developers. And I want to encourage everyone when they're doing their code reviews to ask more questions than providing answers. So keep asking those questions, run it as a dialogue, be open to unexpected answers, because sometimes you're going to get, well, why are we doing it this way? Why is this method static? And you're going to get an answer back and you're like, huh, I never thought of that. And you have to be open to that sort of thing. We have put together a trail mix for you to go and learn more about code reviews. And this trail mix is a whole bunch of links to various sort of luminaries in the software development world talking about how they do code reviews. So it's everyone from Google Engineering's guide to code reviews to, there's a code review guide from Perforce, one of the people who sort of the original giants of the source code, like a source revision systems, so like Git, but they're their own thing. Lots of different information there, and it's really, really insightful. I want to encourage you to go take that trail mix. Let us know what you think of it and what you learned from it on Twitter at Salesforce Devs. And then a couple of other things here. Next week on CodeLive, we're going to be building a mobile app that runs in the Salesforce mobile app. So we're going to be building an app that runs in Salesforce mobile app on your phone to track the best Halloween candy stops. And we're going to be doing this with a developer named Adam Daw. Until then, you can always go to trailhead@salesforce.com and look at the past episode videos. The video for this typically lags by about a day, so hopefully tomorrow you'll be able to log in and see this video. And then one last announcement, and that is at Dreamforce, if you're attending Dreamforce this year, we're going to be doing a little thing we call Iron Coder. And we're going to encourage people to take on our Iron Coder, Renee Winkelmeyer, and you'll be challenging him to build a 5-minute demo out of a secret ingredient, a bit of technology that we know that we're going to give you to build a demo with. You'll have about 40 minutes to build your demo and to try and out-demo the Winkelmeyer for fame and glory. And if you'd like to, apply to be one of those people to absolutely trash talk Renee and, defeat him in a soul-crushing manner, please go to that bit.ly link and fill out the Google form there. With that, remember, if you have more Q&A, you can ask it in Salesforce Devs. You can also hit me at @CodeFryer on Twitter if you have specific questions for me. And you're going to have a feedback survey here at the end of this. Please fill that out. That helps us figure out whether or not we're being successful in teaching and experiencing what we're trying to do here. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you next week.